Okay. Everybody excited to be here?
Yes.
Can you be twice as excited as you normally are?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we'll be in the Gospel of John, but we're going to have to bounce around a little bit today because what I want to talk about is a little bit about unsung heroes. And the trouble with unsung heroes is once you sing about them, they're not so unsung anymore. So my first question to you guys, who was the most famous of Jesus' disciples? No arguments there? It's not like your favorite NBA player or anything like that. People get upset about it. How about second most important disciple? Who would you say there? Okay. Still pretty much agreement with John. How about the third most important? Then we start to wonder who it's going to be. I thought maybe James, since James was there for a lot of important things. Maybe, I kind of struggled at that point. Fourth one's when it got really tough to try to figure out who I would say is the most important disciple. I thought about Mark, but then I realized Mark wasn't a disciple, so that didn't work too well. But today we're going to talk about Andrew. And Andrew is not a very famous disciple. He only shows up in about 9 stories in the gospel. Some of those are repeated. We'll talk about most of it today because most of the time he's just a kind of a side character. So, since I skipped the basketball earlier, who on the 1997 World Champion Chicago Bulls, who played 9 games? Nobody? No, he played all 81 games. Brian Williams played 9 games. So this is Andrew. I think is about as famous to all of us as Brian Williams was back in 1997. Most of his Wikipedia page is about how he retired and walked away from $50 million. Not so much about how he played, but walking away from the game. So let me read a few passages about Andrew to start us off. We'll start with Luke 6:14. And this is indicative of a lot of the stories about Andrew. Luke 6:14. We'll go back to verse 13 for some context here. And when it was day, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. But Andrew was mentioned. And he's mentioned in 3 other lists of the disciples. So even among these few stories that he has, 4 of them are simply lists of the 12 disciples. So to get to maybe a real story about Andrew, let's go to John chapter 1, verse 44, which was not in our text from today, but it does talk about Andrew. Chapter 1 of John, verse 44. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Boy, he sounds like an important guy so far. 5 out of his stories, just names. Mark 13:3 is the same deal. The 4 of them, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, asked Jesus for a sign. He's there. That's about all we have for him. Made me think of maybe like Rodney Dangerfield. Didn't get any respect, just his name sitting there. This week I watched a movie that I would be willing to bet that nobody in here has seen. 1967 movie, The Gospel Blimp. Anyone? Wow. So I get to tell the story. I'm kind of excited. Nobody knows the story. So these neighbors, it's 3 couples who are sitting in their backyard, and they're talking about how can they reach their neighbor for Christ. And this movie was put out by Joseph Bailey, who later became president of David C. Cook Publishing Company. So you can kind of get an idea of where he's coming from. So these 3 couples are talking about how can they reach their neighbor for Christ. And they're discussing some options back and forth. And off in the distance, in between the trees, they see a blimp fly by. And that's when they get the idea that they can come up with a gospel blimp. And so they start trying to figure out exactly how to make this work. They start sending out letters to try to get money. They get some money. They get a donation of a blimp. They decide to incorporate so they wouldn't be liable if something happened, which was a good thing because the blimp crashed. I got stuck between two houses and got on the news and everything. But then they decided they would hire a pilot, and not just a regular pilot, but a distinguished pilot with a beard and everything. And this pilot had gone to school to learn how to fly a blimp. And so he was going to be the person to take this blimp up in the air. And so all of these couples, they gathered up some other people best they could, started meeting a few times a week to talk about how they could use this blimp to reach their neighbors. And they start coming up with these ideas one after another. And the first one is they airdrop these pamphlets all over town. And didn't work terribly well. It got stuck in people's gutters and ended up getting rained on, and nobody was really happy about that. So they decided to get a megaphone and put a megaphone up on the blimp so they could tell everybody about Jesus. And that didn't work either. People just kind of got annoyed because everybody could hear it. So they went a different route, and they chose to do a radio signal instead, so that only the people who were listening to the radio could hear it. Well, that didn't work very well either, because that radio signal started to interfere with the TV signals, and one night on the evening news, people heard the radio signal, and they weren't very happy about that. Well, eventually this guy, one of the couples, he quits because he's just so frustrated with how things are going with this and all the problems that they're having, and they can't figure out what to do. So he just goes back home and does what he always did. Well, on the 1-year anniversary, the same three couples end up together in the same backyard, same barbecue, have the same conversation about how to reach their neighbors. And the guy who had quit, he says, I wanted to tell you guys, my neighbor accepted Jesus last week. And they said, was it the blimp? Was it the Bible verse that we had flying, hanging behind the blimp? No, it wasn't. Well, was it the flyers? No. Was it the radio? No. Wait. You must just be very righteous, and you're saying it wasn't the blimp, it was Jesus who saved it. And he said, no, it had nothing to do with the blimp. And actually, he was pretty upset about the flyers and the radio and all of these things. And they're so confused. They said, how did he accept Jesus? And the guy said, I talked to him. All of this work, making a corporation, getting a blimp, sending letters, collecting things, all of these projects that this International Gospel Blimp Incorporated, whatever it was called, decided to do, none of it worked except when the guy walked across his fence and talked to his neighbor. And I think that's more along the lines of what we ought to do. And that's more along the lines of what Andrew did in the Gospels. What Andrew did in all the rest of his stories, every story that is not a list of names, Andrew is bringing somebody to Jesus. So the first one of those is from our text today, John 1:40. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his brother Simon and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which is Christ. So when I first read that passage, I thought, boy, does that mean that Simon was the other guy? You know, we found the Messiah. We've been searching. We finally did this. But the more I read it, I don't think it was Simon who was the other disciple. I think if we flip over to verse 44. Now Philip was also from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Philip. Philip found Nathanael and said, we have found him whom Moses in the law and the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Now, boy, that sounds just like saying we found the Messiah. The person that the prophets wrote about, the person that the Old Testament is all about. Everything that we have read for our whole lives is leading up to this moment, and we have found him. So I think in this moment, two relatively unknown disciples reach out to other people. Andrew and Philip we could say just about the same thing about. He's going to show up in these same stories that Andrew did. He was in all the same list of names, and in this moment, he shares the gospel with his brother also, reaching out as soon as he learned that the Messiah was there. That was his first thought, was to share it. Flip over to John 6, verse 8. We get another opportunity for Andrew to bring someone to Jesus. I'll go back. John, we'll do chapter 6, verse 5. It should be a familiar story, the feeding of the 5,000, but this is the beginning part before all the really cool stuff happens. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing the multitude was coming to him, Jesus said to Philip, "How are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" This he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. And Philip answered, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to have a little. So in this moment when Jesus asked Philip, what are we going to do? Philip pulls out his calculator and decides it's going to cost about a year's salary to pay everybody. That was his first thought, is how much it's going to cost, how difficult it's going to be, how it's pretty much impossible. Each of these guys gave up their occupations to follow Jesus. It's not like they had a regular income to be able to support feeding 5,000 people. That's a lot, right? If all of a sudden we show up next Sunday, we've got 5,000 people for the potluck, we're going to be in trouble. Dollar General is going to be happy, but we'll be in trouble. So then one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many?" He wasn't quite as worried. I still don't think he knew what was going to happen, but he did something. He found someone that he could bring to Jesus in that moment. And in that moment, Jesus multiplied that effort. This one little boy, 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus does the multiplying. Philip couldn't have multiplied high enough, but Jesus could have. Jesus is the one who does it because Andrew was willing to bring someone to him. In John 12, a bunch of Greek-speaking people come seeking after Jesus, and they find Philip, and Philip brings them to Andrew, and Andrew brings them to Jesus. And I find that to be really interesting because a lot of times when we find someone who needs the gospel, someone who's not a Christian, a lot of times Christians will try to bring them to someone else. My friend knows knows more than me. You should talk to them. And maybe that's what Philip did. I'm not really sure. But Andrew is the one who makes the final mission of taking people to Jesus. This is long before the Great Commission, long before they're told exactly what to do. Most of these stories are before they are even sent out 2 by 2. But what Andrew does is bring people to Jesus. From that first day when he finds Jesus all the way through, that's what he's doing. And I think if that's all we were known for, we've lived a pretty good life. It doesn't matter how many lists of names we were on, but all the other times, Andrew was bringing people to Jesus. I've got no idea how many other times he did that in his life. But when each of these gospel writers were deciding which stories to put in, and we have Luke especially giving interviews with people, trying to research and try to find out what happened so he could report back to Theophilus. These are the stories that we get. And I think that's so cool to think about the kind of life that Andrew would have lived that would result in these stories being recorded for us. That's what people remember about him, is these moments. There's one other story that will come up next week where Peter, Andrew, James, and John will be told, you're not just going to be fishermen, you're going to be fishers of men. So that's going to go along with this, but I don't want to steal Ted's thunder too much. But focusing just on the ones that we have, every time he is bringing people to Jesus. And that's what our mission is also. The Great Commission that the disciples were given, I think, will apply to us also. To teach and to baptize. And not just stop there. But I think we're called to teach the people we baptize how to teach. So they can baptize. And so they can teach. But I think a lot of times we stop. That discipleship process can stop at any generation that doesn't teach people how to be disciples themselves. A lot of people have been good over the years at making disciples, but we're called to make disciples who also make disciples. That's how Christianity multiplies, and that's how it can keep going. One year after another, because more disciples are made. And that only happens if we are people like Andrew. When we find someone, when we find Jesus, we bring someone to him. When we see a need, we bring someone to Jesus. Or when people have questions and they don't know what's going on, we bring them to Jesus. And that's what our life should be known for, just as much as his was. He wasn't the most famous. He probably wasn't the smartest. Even if he was the smartest, that wouldn't have meant very much among the disciples. But he was the one willing to reach out. He was the one willing to do the work like that. And I think he was just as important of a member of this team as Peter or John or James was. Flip back to chapter 1, verse 40. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. And Jesus said, You are Simon the son of John. You shall be called Cephas, which means Peter. What if Andrew had never reached out to his brother? What would have happened? When we get to the story where they all drop their nets and follow, what if it was just Andrew and not the rest? But the rest of these guys hear about Jesus because of others who are bringing people to him. Without Andrew, I wonder when Peter comes to faith. I wonder if Peter's mother-in-law ever gets healed. I would wonder if 1st and 2nd Peter are written. Andrew could never have known that, because back then they were just fishermen. There was nothing all that impressive about them. But because one person was willing to share the gospel to another, we see all of the impact 2,000 years later. Unfortunately, on earth today, in our town today, we can't see what the impact will be 2,000 years later. We just have to do it. We just have to trust that what God says to do, we ought to do. And in order to do that, we each need to be working. We each need to be striving and struggling and trying and realizing that we're all an essential part of the team. That the gospel spreads because of us. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for an example of a life focused on bringing others to you. Lord, I pray that we would be one of these kind of unsung heroes, not so much big and flashy, but doing the behind the scenes things that bring other people to you. Lord, I pray that we would sacrifice, that we would give, that we would serve, that we would learn and teach and disciple so that others can follow you. And I pray, Lord, that you would be the one who multiplies that effort, that you would be the one that makes what we do useful and turns what little bit that we can offer into something great. Lord, help us each day when we get discouraged to know that following after us is at least potentially generation after generation after generation of Christians. People who may only follow after you because of the one person that we speak to today, the one person that we bring to Jesus, the young person that we bring, or the people from the wrong side of town, or whomever it might be. Lord, you have commissioned us. You have commissioned us to do this teaching. And I pray that we would take that commission seriously. Lord, I ask for your patience and your strength. Lord, I pray that we would serve you with all that we have. We would love both neighbor and enemy. And Lord, that we would go forth into this world preaching your gospel, bringing others to you. In Jesus' name, amen.